Personality Trait Models, Part 3, Circumplex Models of Behavior, Professor Michael Montwin, Department of Psychology, California State University, Fresno. The original circumplex model was developed by Timothy Leary. Timothy Leary was a Harvard professor who is infamous for starting to investigate the effects of drugs like LSD. He was fired from his position at Harvard for administering LSD to students. Very rare for a tenured professor to lose their job, but he did. So he set up the circumplex. He did some legitimate personality work. Then he started playing with the magic mushrooms, and the rest is history. He became a counterculture icon. He's in the lyrics of Beatles songs, and he went around with the hippie movement, and his famous saying was, "Turn on, tune in, and drop out." This fake motivational poster has him decked out in some outrageous 1960s suit, and the caption says, "Trouble is, I dropped out so far, I lost my connection, and I can't get FM reception worth a damn." Well, Leary kind of left the circle there, and much later it was picked up by a personality psychologist, Jerry Wiggins. Now, Wiggins was concerned with interpersonal traits, and he defined interpersonal traits as those traits involved in interactions between people involving some kind of exchange of a commodity or resource, in this case a psychological one. Now, Wiggins said the two things that people exchange are love and status. Now, over the years, different researchers have used different labels for each of these two dimensions. You saw Wiggins uses love and hate. You find various dimensions for love. They're all relatively the same label for the same underlying trait. Agreeable, affiliation, communion, friendly, warm, for love. For status, you get things like dominance, power, agency, and ambitiousness. So when you look at the two main dimensions of Wiggins circumplex, you're going to see usually they fall along the lines of dominance versus agreeableness and friendly, power versus affiliation, agency versus communion, or ambitiousness versus warm. Each one of these is a set of two trait labels for the primary axes of the circumplex. Now, with the circumplex, you'll find that the traits are arranged in a circle, hence the name circumplex. Wiggins talks about the advantages of using a circumplex model. One, and the textbook reinforces this, the circumplex model explicitly defines interpersonal behavior. Any exchange of interpersonal behavior is one of status and love. If I like you and I'm powerful, I can do good things for you. If I like you and I'm submissive and wimpy, well, I can't do much for you. Another advantage of the circumplex model is it allows investigators to examine potential gaps in our knowledge of interpersonal behavior. Before we take a look at the circumplex, let us take a little foray into how personality traits function as dimensions. Now, being an old draftsman, I see things in linear fashion, and to me it's easier to draw pictures of personality traits and models, and Wiggins circumplex is definitely a good example of that. Before we get to the circumplex, let me talk to you about how personality traits can be related to each other. And so let's look at three issues here: adjacency, bipolarity, and orthogonality. We'll start with adjacency. Here I've plucked a couple of traits from the circumplex model. we have them represented as lines in mathematical space. So we have a trait of ambitious dominance on one end, lazy submissive on the opposite end, and a trait of gregariousness, extroversion on one end, and aloof, introverted on the opposing end. Traits are adjacent if they are more or less than 90 degrees to each other, and not bipolar. We'll define bipolar next. So basically, any trait not at 90 degrees or not at the opposite end of a trait is adjacent to other traits. And the closer the trait lines are together, the more adjacent they are, and the higher the correlation between the two traits are. Now, clinical psychologists use the notion of bipolarity different than personality folks do. If two traits are on opposite ends of a dimension, they are located mathematically 180 degrees from each other. They'll also have a negative 0.1 correlation. So in this one, we're looking at the trait of ambitiousness, dominance versus lazy and submissive. The more dominant and ambitious you are, the less lazy and submissive, and vice versa. The more lazy and submissive, the less ambitious and dominance. So they're bipolar traits. They define the two ends of the trait. We see that many places of trait work. Our next concept is orthogonality. Orthogonality, fancy sounding word. If two traits are orthogonal to one another, they're perpendicular. Traits that are orthogonal to each other have a 90-degree relationship with each other. So I've plucked out two traits from the circumplex. Again, dominance and submissiveness versus cold and quarrelsomeness versus warm and agreeableness. Lots of stuff here. The traits are perpendicular. They intersect at 1 and 1 point only. And knowing a score on one trait gives you no clue as to an individual's score on the other trait. Although we can do some cool things with this orthogonality that we'll talk about later. So I'm just showing you the relationships right now between traits. So just to kind of get you thinking about things, and we'll come back to this later. Two traits that are orthogonal with each other or 90 degrees have a correlation of 0. Now half of 90 degrees is 45 degrees. And a trait that is located 45 degrees away from another trait is correlated 0.5. Anytime our angle gets greater than 90 degrees, the correlation is negative. So where we have 135 degrees, we have a negative 0.5 correlation. If I have a perfect correlation, it's a 1.0, and I know one person's score on one characteristic, I'll know their exact score on the other. The exact opposite for inverse relationships, for negative correlations. If you're higher on one trait, you're lower on the other systematically. Now that you have all of this wonderful knowledge about traits, let's build our circumplex. First axis here, ambitious and dominance versus lazy and submissive. Find this in most trait models. If you don't find some combination of this in your trait model, I'll tell you one thing about your trait model. It's wrong. Our second dimension, warm and agreeable to cold and quarrelsome. Put them together, they're at 90 degrees to each other, or as I just said, they're what? Orthogonal? Very good. Okay, let's get this a little bit more confusing, as if it's not confusing enough for some of you. The trait of extroversion, gregarious extroversion, aloof introverted, is halfway between ambitious and dominance and warm and agreeable, cold quarrelsome, and lazy submissive. So if it's halfway, it's an arc of 45 degrees and a correlation between dominance and ambitiousness of 0.5. Introverted and aloof is correlated negative 0.5 with ambitiousness and dominance. The final spoke in the interpersonal circle is the last trait in here, halfway between dominance and cold and agreeable and lazy, It's a trait called arrogant, calculating, unassuming, ingenuous. This is the 8-model version of the circumplex. There's also a 16-trait model, but 8's enough for now. What Wiggins did was construct a point in mathematical space equidistant from the center of the circle and constructed scales to measure each one of these things. So in his interpersonal adjective scales, there are traits, 8 trait scores to measure each one of these. And we have the circle now. So let's look at what we can do with this. Just to look at the relationships between the circle, and I think the interpersonal circumplex is good for showing us how traits work in unison in a model and dimensional space. So, a trait correlated with itself. Ambitiousness and dominance is kind of our marker to start with. That's correlated 1.0 with itself. If I correlate ambitious dominance with gregariousness and extroversion, I get a 0.5 correlation. If I go to warm and agreeableness correlating with ambitious dominance, I get 0, because remember that's the orthogonal line there. If I continue going around and I get an angle of 135 degrees, I get a negative 0.5 correlation. And down at the bottom here, the correlation between ambitious dominance and lazy submissive, negative 1.0. Now if I went up the other side of the circle, I would get the same patterns of correlations. Aloof is correlated negative 0.5 with dominance, cold quarrelsome 0, arrogant calculating 0.5. So you've been around the circle today. Let me show you a piece of research that was done by Wiggins and Pincus. What they did was they administered a series of scales to participants, and they completed them. So the subjects, amongst other things, completed the Minnesota Multifaceted Personality Inventory, selected scales from that, from the Personality Adjective Checklist, and also a measure of the interpersonal circle. So Wiggins and Pincus then plotted in the scores for several disorders into the circle. So let's look at how these fit in here. First of all, we get histrionic. It's kind of hysterical, extremely emotional. Notice that's dominant and extroverted in that quadrant. Also notice that the scales don't necessarily plot exactly into the same space. Part of that is measurement differences between the two scales. You're going to get some measurement differences in how that's measured. Second, the theoretical constructs differ slightly across the scales. So, being histrionic is dominant and extroverted. Antisocial. Notice that one really splits across the two different clinical scales, but it's kind of cold-hearted and calculating, which kind of fits in with what I would think of as antisocial a bit. Narcissistic personality disorders are arrogant and calculating. They come close to each other. Then we have dependent people. Notice dependency splits a little bit between the two scales, but they both fall in the submissive, warm quadrant there. And then we get schizoid, and schizoid is aloof and introverted. And then finally we have avoidant people. And notice avoidant is a little bit cold and a little bit, well, a lot submissive. So the interpersonal circle has been used for lots of things. It's been used to study different kinds of relationships. In our next unit on person-environment fit, we're going to look at the Wiggins Circumplex as the basis of a model of person-environment fit. And it gives us a way of thinking about traits as dimensions in mathematical space that can be drawn as lines and can give us some interesting information about how these traits work, and in turn how people behave based on their scores on those traits. So that's all for this part of personality psychology. We'll see you next time with our next trait model, Eysenk's biological model. See you then. This has been a We Have Couches video production. Copyright 2020. Professor Michael Botwin. All rights reserved.